joining us tonight in the Joyful Sex Ed community for our live Q&A. It is the second in a series on transformation through extreme ritual. And last month we had Phoenix B, who was discussing ritual scarification and cutting. And this month, if you listen to the podcast, you will know that we had Jen Erickson with us, and it was a fantastic episode. So I'm going to introduce our later guests as we get going, but I want to first, I want to make sure that everybody knows that, here's someone else here. Everyone knows that it is being recorded. And also that though I assume that everyone is here because they're open to learning about this topic, I don't know everyone in here, your history or your background, or I don't know all the people that are going to be watching the recording right now. So I want to say that tonight we're going to be talking about rituals such as hook pulls and piercing and other forms of possibly other forms of scarification might come up, possibly some context of within the context of BDSM. And so now I will not be showing any images of these activities. However, if you feel upset by something that you hear tonight, it's always a good idea just to be ready to take care of yourself and know how to care for yourself. Sometimes that means just stepping away for a moment and taking a big deep breath and noticing your body and noticing where the sensations are in your body and grounding yourself in the space that you're in. And then it might mean reaching out to someone to talk about what has come up for you. And that includes me. If you feel like you would like to contact me tomorrow, I have plenty of contact information on the website, and I would love to hear from you and hear kind of what came up for you, whether it is positive or negative when my listeners or when the people that come into this community reach out to me and share their experiences. I become a better educator. And so I really appreciate it when you reach out, whatever comes up. So, and then remembering that though this is being recorded, this is being kept within our platform. And so anything that anybody says in here, any listener that asks the questions, we're going to keep that confidential and keep it within this space. So I also want to remind people that I am doing this series in part because I know that we live in a relatively young country with a flawed social structure. And I think that though we're indeed striving for a more perfect union, just like as individuals, we're always striving to be better people, this is a multifaceted and difficult work. And I believe so strongly that we need a wide variety of tools to use in our efforts at transformation and transition. And so transition is a frightening time, whether you're talking about within a society or within yourself, if you're going through transition yourself, or in birth, within birth even. Transition is actually the most dangerous stage of labor. However, it is right before the stage in which we bring new life into the world, that it's right before the point at which we make major changes in our life, in our world, in our communities. And so I really want to encourage people to find all kinds of tools to help them navigate those changes. Now, leather, kink, and alternative lifestyles are often feared and vilified and misunderstood. And so I am so grateful to our guests tonight for the meticulous research that they are doing to and their attempts to demystify this subculture that I believe contains wisdom that really will benefit everyone. So today, Brad and Jen are going to talk about the physiological and social ramifications of rituals such as piercing and scarification. And Sam may address the ways in which the mental health industry has caused harm to people that choose this form of ritual, how things are changing, and most importantly, how all of these shifts will benefit us all. So the goals for this Q&A are, I would like everyone that is here and that listens to this recording to walk away with a greater understanding of the science behind extreme ritual. I would like to expose you to some new perspectives and experiences that you might not hear somewhere else. And I would like you to be able to recognize the value of extreme ritual as a transformative tool. And this doesn't mean that this is something that you want to choose yourself necessarily, but just understanding that it is a tool that some people find very valuable. So when all of this is over, I'm going to go back to this slide and I'm going to ask people if they feel like these goals were reached tonight. So now we are going to get started introducing people. And I am really, really, really excited to introduce Dr. Brad Sagarin. No, I said it wrong, didn't I, Brad? You told you Sagarin. He corrected me. All these years I've known of him and I've said his name the wrong way. And so I just met him face to face a few minutes ago and I think I said it wrong. But Brad is a professor of social and evolutionary psychology at Northern Illinois University. And he is the head of the Science of BDSM research team. Brad studies social influence, resistance to persuasion, deception, jealousy, infidelity, human sexuality, and statistics. All things that I would love to talk to him about in a podcast someday. He has been published in a variety of scholarly journals, has been a consultant for and given interviews to radio, television, and podcast programs. He has presented to academic and non-academic organizations. His research has been cited in newspapers and magazines, including The Economist and New Scientist. And those are very impressive publications. I love The Economist. He holds a doctorate and master's degree in social psychology from Arizona State University and a baccalaureate degree in computer science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And so I'm really thrilled, Brad, that you are here tonight. Thank you for coming to talk to us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Our next, and this is, I wanted to say too, if people want to reach out to Brad, this website right here is a way that you can reach him or other members of the team. And there's access to, I believe this is where there's access to several of the papers that we're going to discuss tonight. Is that right? So our next guest was recently featured on the very popular Pleasure Principle podcast. And Jennifer Erickson is a PhD candidate in the Social Industrial Organizational Psychology program at Northern Illinois University. Her primary research interests include the positive consequences of pain, altered states of consciousness, extreme rituals, and sadism. As part of the Science of BDSM research team, Jen has presented her work at several academic conferences and has presented workshops at several BDSM community conferences and clubs. Thank you so much, Jen, for coming back.
Yeah, I'm happy to be back.
Yeah, I'm glad that I'm going to get to ask you some of the questions that I had to edit out of the program. And last but not least, Sam Hughes is a PhD candidate in psychology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His research focuses on the lives and experiences of people into kink, BDSM, and sexual fetishism. His work also explores the relationship between sexuality, mental health outcomes, attitudes, institutions, social context, and intersectionality. And again, all those things, when I read some of Sam's work, I was like, I've got to get him on my program too. And he has agreed to, so look for that. Relying on both qualitative and quantitative methods, his work has appeared in peer-reviewed academic research journals and has also been covered in Vice, Psychology Today, Insider, and Dan Savage's Savage Lovecast. So, Sam, when we finally get a chance someday to meet face to face, you'll have to allow me to touch the hem of your robes just for that last one being referred to on Dan Savage's Lovecast. So thank you, Sam, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah. So today I am going to stop sharing now. And I'm going to get started with, first I want to tell people that if they have any questions that come up for them in our conversation, out of our conversation today, or if they listen to the podcast and they just have some burning questions, go ahead and type those in the chat box. Or when I take breaks from my questions, just unmute yourself and ask any one of our listeners a question. So go ahead and do that. First, I think that actually when I see everybody in there, I think everybody here pretty much has a good idea of what we're talking about. Really the whole, like, what is a hook pull? What is all of that? So I don't think I need to go into that. I had a section out of one of your papers, Brad, that I was going to read describing that, but I think everybody here today probably has a good idea of what we're talking about. So my initial questions, and I'm going to state these two questions, and then I'm going to ask each one of you to answer whichever one you prefer answering. So if I want to ask you, if you have a personal connection to the kink culture or leather culture, can you tell us what that connection is? And if that connection played a part in your decision to conduct this research that you're doing? And then the second question is, what was your sex education like as a child? And how do you think it affected you and your chosen career path? So whichever one of those questions you would like to ask. Brad, would you like to get started for us?
Sure. So let me talk briefly about the sex education. It's a great question. My sex education as a kid was remarkably inadequate. And probably the example to me that really comes to mind is that back in 10th grade, I was dating a young woman, and we had a pregnancy scare. And it was, of course, pretty alarming for both of us. And thinking back on what we did, we had done nothing that could have possibly gotten her pregnant. And yet just what we had learned was basically, if you kiss, if you start to do any of this stuff, then you're going to get pregnant, you're going to get STIs, you're going to die. And it worked. I was pretty well indoctrinated into a lot of BS. And so one of the things that I now try to do, both in my research and also in my teaching, is to just get some of the basic facts out there so people know what they're talking about. So it's definitely been part of what's inspired my work.
Thank you. Do you want to, Sam, do you want to answer one or both of those questions, whichever you prefer?
Sure, I can blend these together. So I grew up in a small area of Minnesota called Coon Rapids, and I grew up as a fundamentalist evangelical Christian. And by the time that I entered my adolescence and started to realize that I was both gay and also into a lot of kink interests and fetish interests, it was really this kind of emotionally disturbing period of my life because there felt so much conflict between those aspects of my identity. And so by the time that I got to high school, I sort of shoved everything down as much as possible and focused on being like the straight A perfect student, overachiever, in charge of a whole bunch of different clubs and things. And once I got to college and I was finally ready to come out about both being gay and also being involved in kink and BDSM, I'd still developed this really strong kind of geeky academic aspect of my identity. And so I see today as a PhD candidate being able to combine those aspects of my identity, being sort of nerdy and geeky and into stats and loving research, while also still being able to be the sort of out kinky person that I am and study these communities that I really love.
Well, that is wonderful. I'm so glad that you are taking those experiences and channeling them in the way that you are. It's a great gift to the community as a whole. So, Jen, do you want to answer one or both?
Yeah, what's funny is I was actually going to talk about the sex education I received in a small town in Minnesota and how that kind of paired with my Mormon upbringing. So there's some kind of similarities here with what Sam had mentioned. So I received my education in a small town called Randolph. To tell you how small it is, they had like a gas station and two bars, and that was it. Like that was the town. So my sex education really just focused on like labeling the different components of like the reproductive system, and then I think there was like a really quick blurb of like, don't have sex, that's the best way to not get pregnant, and that was it. So like, definitely left me with a whole lot of questions. And being raised Mormon, this wasn't really something that I felt comfortable coming to my parents with, because you don't have sex until after you're married, being that good Mormon. But I did grow up with just having an avid curiosity for everything in the world. I always wanted to know how things worked or why they worked the way they did. And this was absolutely true with sexuality too. It's, like I mentioned on the podcast, it's just everybody's wired so differently. And I always wanted to know why that was the case. And so it just naturally dovetailed into my research that I do now. And I absolutely love it.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you all very much. So my first question is going to go back to Sam, because this first question kind of tries to place this whole conversation within a historical context. So Sam, you discussed in one of your papers the fact that kinky desires have been pathologized since the birth of sexual science in the late 19th century. And so can you talk about how that stigma has manifested within the healthcare community, and specifically define for us paraphilia and paraphilic disorder, and tell us what the difference is between those terms, and tell us why it's really important to understand those differences?
So in the late 1800s, both France and Germany are dealing with the sort of fallout of the Franco-Prussian War, and both of them are starting to become really concerned with anything that's going to sort of decrease the population of either of those two countries. And so out of that, we start to see this sort of science of sexuality, especially focusing on pathologizing non-procreative forms of sexuality, so anything that isn't resulting in increasing the population of these countries, really start to emerge. Sort of most classically, we see some of this from Binet in France, who's defining fetishism in some of these really early documents. And then a little bit later, we start seeing more work from Psychopathia Sexualis, talking about sadism and masochism. And so in this sort of particular historical time period where everyone suddenly becomes very concerned, not only with kink and fetishism, but also with homosexuality and transvestic fetishism, this then becomes the period where science starts naming and labeling and categorizing a variety of different forms of human sexual diversity as pathological, as these kinds of sicknesses. And over the history of clinical psychology, we sort of initially saw work where people were trying to discover the sort of biological origins behind people's quote unquote sexual pathologies. And we know this from a wonderful chapter called Closing Up the Corpses, that after spending so much time trying to find the sort of biological causes of all of these things, for example, looking into the brains of masturbators by dissecting their corpses and not finding any lesions there, we start to develop this new category in clinical psychology called the sort of functional pathology, that it's not that there's something wrong with somebody's body, but there's this assumption that if somebody's behavior is functionally wrong in some way, then that is just as much of a pathology as having a lesion in your liver or a lesion in your brain. And so as a result of the creation of that category, we then start to see over time more and more of these paraphilias getting labeled in the DSM. So a paraphilia is a term that was used before the most recent edition of the DSM in 2013, just to describe anyone who has any kind of sexual interest that deviates from social norms and was presumed to be a pathology. Once we hit 2013, both as a result of some work from the National Coalition of Sexual Freedom and from a bunch of evidence that was compounding from scientific studies, demonstrating that lots of kinky people are not at all experiencing the kind of like mental health problems that people would sort of assume go along with pathology. They created a new distinction in the categorization scheme that they use for these disorders between a paraphilia and a paraphilic disorder. So a person who has a paraphilia is someone that has recurrent, intense interests in some kind of non-normative sexual behavior or sexual interest. So sometimes this refers to things like being interested in feet or being interested in fetish objects. Sometimes it's about sadomasochism. And it's also lumped in with a number of interests that are non-consensual. So things like pedophilia or voyeurism, where the kinds of people that might put a camera in a public restroom. So by lumping all of these categories together and calling them all the paraphilias, the 2013 version of the DSM created a new category called paraphilic disorders to try and distinguish between people who just had atypical sexual interests and people who actually had a disorder. And the main distinction for most of these categories that they make is that either the person experiences clinically significant distress or impairment, or the person acts on their desires with a non-consenting person. And so we're starting to see this sort of long, centuries-long history of pathologizing kinky people start to change, especially over work that's been done in the last decade or so. But at the same time, there's still some more work to go. People like Charles Mosier have done some really wonderful work critiquing even the current definitions in the DSM-5. And one of the sort of ways that you might think about this is that it sort of has defined anyone who has an interest and acts on it non-consensually with another person as sort of de facto having a mental disorder. And that seems to mean that anyone who ever commits a crime that's related to that must necessarily mean because it's the result of a mental disorder. But we don't have mental disorders for all sorts of other crimes in the DSM. We don't have an arson disorder. We don't have a domestic violence disorder. And so this assumption that something must be a mental pathology solely because it's immoral or solely because it's illegal is one that doesn't seem to necessarily hold up. And so there's still active debates about the sort of usefulness of these categories. This is particularly highlighted because based on a bunch of psychiatry that we have, basically nobody outside of a criminal forensic context is actually getting diagnosed with any of these paraphilic disorders. And so it largely seems to be just this kind of criminal category that's being used and may not necessarily be helpful. In the meantime, it's also created this kind of pathological master narrative about what it means to be kinky, where people will sort of point to the DSM casually and say, well, clearly this is a mental disorder, so there's something wrong with you. Even though we've made changes since the 2013 edition, this sort of long, centuries-long history of doing this still really pervades today in terms of how people stigmatize and discriminate against kinky people, and also about the narratives that some kinky people will internalize and tell about themselves, which we know from at least some of my research seems to be related to negative mental health outcomes like depression and suicidality.
That is fascinating. That was a wonderful summary of all of that. It makes me want to get a T-shirt that says something about owning my paraphilia. But I thank you very much, Sam, and that's important, and it also brings to light why it is all the research that anyone is doing around in the field of sexuality is so important, and in particular in the research around I don't know, kinky or outside the norm behavior research. So I want to go to I would like to go to Brad next. And Brad, I'm going to ask this question, and with the side note that if there's something new in some kind of new research that you're doing or other research that you would really rather talk about, you can say, you know what, I'll talk about that on the podcast. I want to talk about this right now. But what I wanted to ask you was that I had to cut out a whole section in our interview with Jen where we talked about the research that has been done, that you've done monitoring folks' brainwaves. And I wanted to know if you could talk about why you're doing that and how you gather that data and maybe what you have found so far.
Sure. So this is, I think, one of the most exciting directions that our research team is taking right now. And we're using EEG to look at the brainwave patterns in people doing consensual BDSM scenes. And we're very interested in looking at what's going on with the brains of both the tops and the bottoms in scenes, the top being the person who's tying the other person up, swinging the flogger, the bottom being the person who's being tied up, receiving the sensations. And we're interested in this for a number of reasons. One of them is the evidence that we've collected so far, looking at the altered states of consciousness, is pretty indirect. And so we do have some evidence showing cognitive deficits in bottoms in BDSM scenes, as well as participants in body rituals, that's pretty suggestive of what the community sometimes calls subspace, this really pleasurable, altered state of consciousness that people sometimes achieve when they go through these kinds of experiences. And on the top side, we also have some indirect evidence really there through self-report, people just kind of describing on scales what their experience is, a state that we think of as flow, where somebody is deeply enmeshed and performing optimally, where the rest of the world fades out and they're just focused intensely on the thing that they're doing. Also a very pleasurable, wonderful state to be in. So we're interested in EEG to try to get some more direct evidence of what's going on with the brain. And so we are just starting this work. Unfortunately, we were then, as the rest of the world was, sent into lockdown. And so our EEG equipment is gathering dust right now. But we've collected data on a small number of scenes, as well as I think some of the most interesting data we've collected so far was on a person who was doing a full body suspension. And that showed just some fascinating patterns of what was going on with the brain while he was getting pierced, as he was going into the suspension, and then what was going on internally, which we had a chance to talk with him afterwards and kind of look over what was going on during the suspension and get his kind of inner experience to match with the brain patterns. It was just fascinating stuff. I actually don't want to steal Jen's thunder because this was a study that actually she was the principal investigator for, but they're just some really wonderful, exciting data.
Yeah, I mean, I could jump in and talk a little bit more about so what Brad's mentioning with the hook suspension, that's really the only piece that we have fully analyzed with the EEG, just because we are so new at this. But it was just really fascinating to see. So what we do when we set up the EEGs is in real time, I or whichever researcher is leading that round of data collection, they can see the brain waves in real time. And then what you do is before everything even starts, you ask the person what they think might go on. So some of the things that they might either be experiencing or physically doing, etc. And then you can enter that into the computer and then mark when that moment occurs. So that way, if they go in a scene, for example, if they do some flogging to then, showing some care, having like rest, whatever it may be, you can alternate between those. And then what happens is the computer will aggregate all of the instances of when that one activity was occurring and see what the brain looks like for that one activity. So with this hook suspension, to give it a little bit of context, one, we just wanted to see if it could work for rituals, because one of the issues with EEGs is they are highly sensitive to movement. So one of the device that we do have is able to clean up a good bit of that, but we still wanted to see just what that would look like and if it would be a viable measure to use, because just with hook suspensions in particular, there's just so much swinging and moving around and all of that. So the person who we measured this with, he was actually doing this hook suspension to mourn several deaths of very close people to him in the last couple of years. And what was very interesting is, so I marked when he received each of 4 piercings, and with that, we could actually see through the EEG that the 4th piercing was incredibly painful or hurt more than the rest of them, which was kind of interesting. And then, we see the markers of everything else that's kind of occurring throughout his suspension. And then toward the end of it, outwardly, he was staying completely still. But I look at the computer and the waves are going all over the place, just going crazy. So I made a note, I marked it with just as in an other category, and then asked him about it later. And as it turns out, that was the point in his suspension that he was mentally saying the names of everybody he had lost over the next couple of years. So what we were able to see is mourning and what that looked like for him.
That's really powerful. That's really powerful. I had to just take a moment, just like take that in, because I really want to. I mean, that's the kind of thing that tells us how the research that you're doing is so broadly applicable to everyone. Just understanding how grief sits in our bodies and what we can do to work that through. And our whole world right now, man, we got a lot of that. We've got a lot of that to work through. So I'm really, again, so grateful that you are doing this work. I really appreciate it. So I wanted to, I think maybe then go back. Let me go back to you, Brad, real quickly, because you just kind of answered that real short answer. In in the study on extreme ritual in the context of BDSM, one method of gathering data that you had was with open-ended responses. It's like what you have been talking about was gathering data with the EEGs. Now, another one is open-ended responses. So first, can you tell our listeners what that means exactly, what an open-ended response means, how you analyze that data, and then tell us what you think was the most important finding of this part of the study?
Thanks. It's a great question. We try to use a lot of different methods to triangulate in on what's going on, because inevitably these are complicated, multifaceted experiences. In fact, being in the midst of the data collection at the Dance of Souls, where we had the opportunity to collect data in 2 different years, was a wonderful, sometimes overwhelming experience in terms of just what everybody is going through and this incredible drumming and everything. And so to try to get a picture of what's going on, we really try to apply a lot of different methods. So we do saliva sampling to get a measure of people's cortisol levels. It's a stress-related hormone. We use validated psychological scales to look at people's positive and negative affect, the level of stress they're feeling, how sexually aroused people are feeling, and that sort of thing. We use cognitive tests to look at altered states of consciousness. And then we also try to measure open-ended responses, which was where your question began, where we just basically give people space to share their experience. We try to measure before they start the ritual, what are your expectations? What role are you planning to do? What are you looking to get out of it? We sometimes, during the ritual, when somebody takes a break, we really try to not disrupt the activity as much as, in any way, but when somebody is taking a break, if they want to, they can fill out a brief survey and kind of give us a snapshot of what's going on with them. And then they will often give us sometimes lengthy answers afterwards about what their experience is. We then go through a process of trying to code the themes that emerge. And one of the really wonderful things about open-ended answers like this is you get lots of stuff you don't expect. We have some expectations going in, but for example, we went into the study of the Dance of Souls. This was this hook pull ritual conducted at the Southwest Leather Conference, naively thinking that this was going to be a non-sexual manifestation of BDSM. In fact, the very first presentation that our team did, which was at Southwest Leather Conference in 2011, one of the questions that we got from an attendee was, well, all the research, Brad, you've talked about is all having to do with sex. Where is the research on non-sexual BDSM? And I was kind of taken aback and thought about it for a second and said, there is none. And later, I had a chance to attend the Dance of Souls, and I looked around at what was going on and said, oh, here it is. This is the non-sexual manifestation of it. And then next year, we were really grateful to be invited back to collect data there. However, that wasn't what our participants said was going on. When we looked at the open-ended answers, what we found was that people were not experiencing this as sadomasochism. This was not a BDSM scene. This was primarily a spiritual experience that people were having, using piercing and other activities that might be akin to what you see in a scene. But if we hadn't asked those questions, we would have never known. And so I think that giving people a chance to speak in their own voice, and even though it tends to be a fair amount of work then when we get a chance to try to code and extract the themes, really wonderful stuff can emerge. And so that's, I guess, a bit of the process that we use.
That's very interesting. And when I really do encourage people to go to their website and look at these papers. They're very, very interesting. And even I'm trying to recall, because I've read so many different papers over the last few weeks, but I think I read this in one of the papers that is on your website, but really describing that process and how you analyzed it and how you got your team together to look at it. It's a fascinating process. So thank you for sharing that. And I really encourage people to go in and look at that some more. So I want to go back to Sam now. And Sam, I love the phrase liberatory narrative. And I really want folks to understand this term. And so can you briefly describe kind of the 3 central themes of this narrative? And then if you can, because my tagline for my business is holistic sex education fuels social change. There's this one sentence that really jumped out at me, and so I'm going to ask you to kind of expound on that sentence or talk about that a little bit. And that sentence is: these narratives, in turn, can provoke social change through the way in which individuals draw on multiplicity and variability as they narrate their stories to a different audience.
So maybe to start by just providing some context, this is coming from a study where we had participants that were 265 participants who identified as kinky answer an anonymous online survey where we asked them a whole bunch of these open-ended questions. One of the open-ended questions we asked for this particular study was, do you feel negatively, positively, or mixed about your kink identity? Please explain why. And then gave them a big open-ended text box so that people could provide their story or their narrative about what their kink identity means to them and sort of their identity sentiment, how it is they feel about their own identities. And we're contextualizing this in sort of two competing narratives that many kinky people have to live with. One of them is this pathological narrative, the one that's often coming from kind of clinical context, occasionally from religious contexts as well. And then the other big narrative is this liberatory narrative. And we're sort of thinking about the liberatory narrative, the sort of thinking about kink as a form of liberation of the self, as having these three big central areas. So one is that kink is centering consent and collaborative scripting of roles and scenes. So unlike the sort of general sexual world in which often scripts that we are supposed to follow in terms of sexuality are assumed or forced upon us, kink becomes this opportunity for us to negotiate and say, this is what we want to create out of the sexual experience and sexual roles that we want to experience. And so it helps to liberate us from those broader social narratives that are often thrust upon us without our consent. The second big theme of this kind of liberatory kink narrative is that it offers people the opportunity for recreational power exchange and role exploration, often in this kind of safe context. And so you might think about the classic example of the like Wall Street CEO who's really stressed out about their job and then goes and sees a dominatrix as a way to sort of submit and experience a different kind of role. You might similarly see this among, the kind of person that has a wet and messy fetish where they're into being covered in mud. These are often the kinds of people who are really like freaky, kind of neat freak people who need an opportunity to escape from some of that daily role. Or they might be the kind of people who work in a medical context or in a food service context where they spend all day worrying very carefully about hygiene and sort of cleanliness and safety. And this becomes a way to escape from those roles and stressors. So it's a liberation from those kinds of roles and stressors we experience in daily life. The third part of this liberatory narrative is that it emphasizes the meaning and value of this kind of subcultural community. So it's not just often that we're doing kink on our own or that we are creating just kind of individual meanings for ourselves, but often this is situated in larger communities of people who are constructing the meaning of these identities in sort of broader, more social ways. And so there's a liberation from a sort of isolated individualist experience of kink by being able to construct a sort of community or culture around what it is that kink means and how it is that people engage with those kinds of activities. So those are the three kinds of big liberatory narratives we see. And I see this as being tied in with kind of variability and multiplicity in that people are saying there isn't just one story about our sexualities. There are many different stories, and we often get to define what those stories mean. That's part of what empowers people in kink is it becomes this play space where people can be and do what they want by constructing a narrative or constructing a set of symbols or constructing a set of roles and props and costumes with other people that they're playing with. There's a kind of theatrical collaborative dimension to it that can be really healing. I think about this currently in the work that I've been doing right now, where we have 78 erotic hypnosis fetishists, so people that are sexually turned on by playing with hypnosis. And many of them have talked about using erotic hypnosis as a way to liberate themselves from daily roles or being able to even construct a physical reality that isn't actually possible. So I've talked with people who are furries that are able to experience being their fursona for the first time by engaging in erotic hypnosis. So there's a way in which even the sort of sense of the physical body can be liberated through some of these altered states of consciousness that people are playing with through kink.
That's very, very interesting. Thank you so much for explaining that. Yeah, it's just a wonderful phrase in general, but then when you dive into the depths of really what it means, it's profound. I mean, it's really profound for people as individuals and ultimately for our society. I'm going to go back to Jen now, if you are here, Jen. I wanted to, I know that when I talked to you for the podcast, when you brought up endocannabinoids, your face just lit up. And you really, this, I could tell you really wanted to talk about this. And we had a fairly limited amount of time. So I wanted to see if you wanted to talk about that a little bit more. And then this, really for my own personal benefit and curiosity, if I wanted to get my endocannabinoids up a little bit, so is there any activity that does that more efficiently than any other? And I forgot to say too that the whole thing, like I didn't know that term until I hadn't heard of that until you said it the other day. Though I have a basic grasp of, endorphins and hormones in the body, then a lot of them come from the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. And but I don't know where endocannabinoids come from. So tell us.
So I'm going to do mostly big. I don't know. I'll start with that. It's since measuring endocannabinoids has been a little bit of a big pipe dream for me. I haven't really researched too deeply into it because it is so far outside of my wheelhouse. So I can tell you what I do know, what I do remember of it, and then maybe do a tag team. I mean, that's one of the great things of having several researchers here is you can like tap into the hive mind to see what everybody remembers with that. But so yeah, endocannabinoids. They are relatively new. I think it was early to mid 90s is when they were first discovered. So there's still a lot of unknowns with them. The first one that was discovered is called anandamide. And that comes from the Hindu goddess Ananda, which means bliss. And so it's kind of known as being the bliss chemical. So it has been found to be associated with feelings of bonding. So actually childbirth is one of the ways of increasing the endocannabinoids because it helps to establish that bonding and care between the mother and the child. It has also been related with feelings of closeness between others. So it's just, there's really a lot of stuff there that just really seems to like it would answer what's going on during BDSM scenes and why people are feeling closer to each other, and as well in extreme rituals as well. And then it was actually just recently, somebody else on the team had sent us a newspaper article discussing that it may be the endocannabinoids instead of endorphins that's causing the runner's high. And this came from some studies that actually they blocked the uptake of endorphins in rats. And so as they're running in their wheels, they didn't experience that runner's high. They didn't get that feeling of relaxation that comes from the end of that. They were still kind of that pent up and anxious and all that. However, it's when I got this backwards. I'm sorry. So when they block the or the endorphins, the mice still experience the runner's high. But when they block the endocannabinoids, that's when they did not experience the runner's high. So that seems to suggest that it's endorphins, which has been credited with just so many pleasurable aspects and moods and all that. That may not be what's driving a lot of it. And now I will tag off to see if anybody happens to remember more.
I can't add a lot about the physiology, but just to underscore one of the points that Jen made, I think one of the really exciting things about starting to look at the physiological reactions in that way is that it may give us a handle on how the psychological things that we have really reliably observed, how that might be manifesting in the brain and in the body. So that across multiple studies in both rituals and in BDSM scenes, we've seen this bonding that happens between either a couple that's doing a BDSM scene or really the whole group that's doing a ritual. And I, as well, am just fascinated by the possibility of understanding neurologically and physiologically how that's coming to be, to sort of delve deeper than just the psychological effect that we're seeing.
One thing I'll add to another study that we conducted, I think we had 260 participants, and we asked them to report where they saw their kinks as having originated or coming from, or why it is that they're kinky. And we found many of our participants giving these responses that actually talked explicitly about endorphins. So they would say, these are the particular neurotransmitters in my brain that I feel like I'm getting by engaging in these kinds of kink scenes. And so I always find it interesting how this discourse of science that we're using for understanding what's going on in the brain and what's going on in the body can in turn have this kind of feedback loop for how people come to understand themselves and construct the narrative about what it means to be kinky for themselves as well.
Well, and I think especially as we're seeing converging bodies of research that seem to show in a lot of ways that these are multiple paths to the same place. And that for some people, kink may be what resonates for them. For other people, it's running. For some people, it's meditation. It may be a lot of different things. But really, we're seeing this convergence of the kinds of altered states that people get in. And it's just a variety of different paths, which I think is really fascinating. And Sam, I'm very excited to hear about that as coming out in the narratives of your research.
Well, actually, that I might then lead into another question for you, Sam, for talking about the narratives, people's narratives about their identity. And so my question for you around that was asking if you would define narrative engagement for us. And I don't, and then briefly tell folks about the 4 larger thematic patterns within that.
So when I say narrative engagement, what I usually mean is the sort of narratives that exist out there in the world about people's identities and the ways in which we have to engage with them. So I talked earlier about the sort of the pathology narrative that says that what it means to be kinky is to be sick, and this liberatory narrative that what it means to be kinky is to be able to be free to explore and be free from social constraints that might limit us. And so that's what I mean broadly when I'm talking about narrative engagement. One of the ways that people will construct a narrative about their own identity is by constructing a narrative about the start of their identity or the origins of their identity. And so in this study where we had 260 participants and we asked people about where they saw their kinks as coming from, we got sort of 4 big discourses that people would talk about. So some people would talk about it as a form of identity in and of itself. And there are many variations on this. So some people would say, I'm just kinky and that's a part of me that I love. Other people would talk about their relationship with communities and the positivity that they experience from those communities. Other people would talk about it as this form of role exploration and a way of sort of finding peace with their identity by being able to explore multiple sides of themselves. So these kinds of identity narratives were extremely common in our data set. This vast majority of kinky people had some variation of thinking of themselves as a sort of positive kinky person in some way. Then we would have these nature narratives, which would be ones that would point explicitly to like, I was born this way, it's in my genetics, here are the neurotransmitters in my brain, where people are using the language of biology and the language of sort of biological science in order to explain how it is they understand what it means for why it is that they're kinky. We would also, interestingly, get these responses that we called the negation category, where people would say, here's this story that's out there about why people are kinky, and I know that that doesn't apply to me. So sometimes we would get these where they would reject the genetic narrative, where they'd say, I have checked and I know my parents are super duper vanilla, and so I know it's probably not in my genes. And similarly, when it came to these nurture narratives, where people would say, it's about a way that I was raised as a child, or an experience that I had growing up, or a traumatic experience that I may have had, for those kinds of folks, there were similarly folks in the negation category that were rejecting some of those narratives for themselves, saying, I know that I wasn't abused as a kid, so I know it's not something like that. Or, I know that it's not because of the way that I was parented, because this is the way that I was parented. And so those kinds of stories, I think for me, really underscore how many different kinds of stories people have about why they're kinky, and that almost certainly there's no single narrative that sort of explains all of it, right? My own theory often is rooted in the idea that we're playing with symbols that we find to be meaningful for the kinds of emotional states that we're seeking to experience, the kinds of physical states that we're seeking to experience. And it's part of the reason why, many of the fetish interests that are out there are things that might have a whole lot of meaning, even if they're not something that could be sort of classically conditioned in necessarily. The example that I love to give of this is the Kleenex box. Like almost no one on earth has a Kleenex box fetish, and yet many high school and middle school boys might be masturbating into Kleenex. And so you'd imagine if this was just a sort of classical conditioning explanation, that the Kleenex box would be one of the most popular fetishes out there in the world. And on the flip side, full body latex suits are extremely popular as a fetish, but like what seventh grader has access to a full body latex suit, right? So I think that it's often about these symbols that have a whole lot of meaning for us and the way that we construct those meanings to help create positive benefits for our lives, whether it's about exploring our identities, whether it's about experiencing a physical sensation or being able to experience an altered state of consciousness, whether it's about being able to replay an experience that we may have had in our childhood and being able to sense it with an experience of mastery or having control over it or being able to stop it when we want to. There are so many of these different kinds of symbols that people are often playing with and constructing and creating meaning out of, that there's no single story of where kinky people come from that we could ever really get.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining that. That's yeah, storytelling. It's a key part of being human, isn't it? And so it's important to study all of that. We are getting close to an hour. And so I'm going to, I'm going to, before I go into any of my other questions, I'm going to just ask, I think, if there's anything that any of you all are working on right now that you really want to talk about, that you feel like you would really like people to hear or understand. And Brad, can you talk to folks a little bit?
Sure. So one of the most recent lines of inquiry that we've started to go into is really looking at intersectionality. And I feel like this has been my job tonight, is to basically like hawk studies that in fact Jen is running. So let me once again say I'm going to be riding her coattails on this really like wonderful set of studies that she's doing. But where we started to look at the intersection of race and ethnicity and kink, we have a paper that is under review right now. That started to look at that and has really examined some very troubling veins of racism that run through the kink community, and what the community might be able to do to, in fact, realize the more inclusive vision that I think many people in the community have. We've also started to look at gender presentation and some questions about the intersection of gender and gender presentation and gender identity and kink. And I'm really excited about those because I think that they touch on issues that go well beyond kink in terms of things that our society is really wrestling with. And the other thing that I've found is that having those data to look at has been a way of facilitating some really valuable conversations, for instance, at kink events, where we've had very diverse groups of people be able to look at our data on race and kink and in a very non-defensive and open way wrestle with some of these questions that have very, very large implications. And so for me, I think that those are some of the directions that I'm most excited about. So sorry, Jen.
Actually, if you don't mind, I'll do a shameless plug. And one of the intersectionality surveys we have open right now. We'll be closing soon. So if anybody is interested, we're actually looking at different kink communities. So the women's community, men's community, queer and pan community, and just kind of looking at how gender presentation kind of plays into feelings of inclusivity within those different communities.
So I'm also looking at diversity and intersectionality right now, in part because I think all of us would probably agree that much of the research so far on kink is really strongly focused on white communities and mostly white participants. And one of the things that we're trying to do with this current erotic hypnosis study, we currently have 39% of our participants are people of color, and we've been really trying to dig into what are those kind of unique experiences of both discrimination, but also of other aspects of culture that might be missing. And one thing I found really interesting on the gender level has been the number of people that are trans and non-binary talking about using using erotic hypnosis to alleviate some of their gender dysphoria. Often when people are engaging in sex, it can be this really dysphoric experience because sex is often so body focused. And for people that are trans or non-binary, getting into a hypnotic state where they can get a suggestion about a way to experience or feel their body or look down and see breasts for the first time has often for many of them been a way to alleviate this experience. It always speaks to me of like how wonderful these altered states of consciousness and experiences in kink can be for impacting other aspects of our lives that may not necessarily be the ones we immediately think of.
Yeah, that's very concise and said much more thoroughly than I try to say that a lot, that the things that we talk about in sex education is it's not just about sex. It's like it's really spreads out into all aspects of your life, out into your family, out into the community. And so I am just so grateful for you all's time tonight. The things that you're talking about starting right now is the research around race and intersectionality and all of that is very exciting, and I look forward to having you back to talk about what you're finding in these studies. I want to ask people that maybe are watching the recording of this, or the people that are here, to go ahead and maybe tell us, you can email or let me know, or just think for yourself about maybe how the goals of this Q&A were met for you. Like, how much understanding do you feel like you gained about the science of BDSM and all of the goals that we had? I want to, there we go. I want to again offer this website for people to go to if they want to read any of these amazing papers or reach out to any of the people on this team. Sam, if you want to, if there's any contact information that you have, if you want to share that with me, maybe put it in the chat, and then I'll take that and I'll share that in the community too, or maybe put it out in a post if people want to reach out to you, because you've all said some really amazing things, and I know people may have questions and want to reach out. If you have any questions for me, of course you can reach me through the website at joyfulsexed.com, and always email me. And I'm so grateful again to all of you, and I hope that you will come back and talk with me again.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful, and I would be delighted to come back.
Thank you for having us.
That was great.